let's get into who should actually win Player of the Year, because there's so many variables and so many thoughts and feelings that get into this decision that it gets so murky, and it does definitely feel like a Pepe Sylvia moment. Let's get into it.
Pepe Sylvia, this name keeps coming up over and over again. Every day, Pepe's mail's getting sent back to me. Pepe Sylvia, Pepe Sylvia. I look in the mail, well, this whole box is Pepe Sylvia!
Alright, so first off, I think we have to talk about FPO because it was such a toss-up. You had Missy Gannon getting 2 wins, Holland Hanley getting 2 wins, clutching it up at USDGC. You had Owen destroying, and then you had Kristen doing kind of okay, I guess. But no, obviously this is a total domination. KT, Player of the Year, not even a question. Actually won 4 more events than Owen in kind of hilarious fashion, even though Owen has 8 wins and Kristen has 12. If you look deeper, it is actually a total landslide because only one of those wins from Owen was a Pro Tour win, and Kristen actually won 11 Pro Tour wins this year. So without a doubt, Kristen is the Player of the Year, obviously. But going on to MPO, it is actually a more interesting question than I think a lot of people are phrasing it as, because you could just say, well, obviously Isaac has 2 major wins, and that is without a doubt enough to make you the Player of the Year. And while I do think there is some merit to that, and I think it is definitely resonating with other people, and especially on this post on r/disc golf where somebody was saying it is absolutely insane that anyone thinks anybody who won 2 majors is not the Player of the Year. If this was Paul, it would be an absolute landslide. And yeah, obviously, if this was Paul, there'd be different factors at play. And I think that really lends itself to why I think the Player of the Year is just so unbelievably arbitrary. It really seems to force you to think about what is the Worlds actually worth. So many people think of Worlds as like the only thing that matters, and if you win, then you obviously are like the greatest player ever, and there is nobody that can really compete with you for that current year. And I kind of think it's not the case. And looking at last year, even though Ricky didn't win a lot of majors, he still had 5 total wins, lending himself to be a Player of the Year. So there is some precedent that the Player of the Year is not purely based upon major wins. But I think right now the sentiment is that Isaac is a beast, and if you beast it up in the majors, then you have a higher degree of probability of winning Player of the Year. But for me, I kind of think it is much more nuanced than that. And before we get too deep into actual numbers, looking at the history of who's actually won Player of the Year, it was kind of surprising. So somebody that's won 3 times that you may not have guessed, Nico LaCastro, 2009, 2010, and 2011. So he's been crushing for a while. And then Ricky's won 4 times, and kind of surprising, Paul's only had 5 total wins, and none of them being what I believe to be the modern era of disc golf, with his last one being 2019. So even though we think of Paul as like the GOAT, greatest of all, he's only had 1 higher finish than Ricky for Player of the Year, and none of them being at all recent. And actually scratch that, because Ricky won last year, so Ricky and Paul actually have the same number of Player of the Years, which also lends credit to it being sort of arbitrary, because we definitely think of Ricky as some degree lower than Paul. Alright, so on to the stats. So as far as Ricky goes, he's actually only won the Preserve and the Tour Championship. There really is just no spot for him in the Player of the Year. Still a great recovery from him with his injuries, but really just not in the race. And then next up, Simon. Again, one of those people that has what feels like a good year for him with the transition going to MVP. But looking at the stats, it still just wasn't phenomenal. 47th at LVC, 11th at Worlds, 51st at OTB, and then he did win Music City Open and D-Glow. Very, very good. Also a 3rd place finish at USDGC and 4th place at MVP. Very good finishes. Love to see him still fight for a great season after arguably his best season of all time last year, but still not enough to really count himself in the fight. But this is where it gets into that murky territory. You could say that, I mean, it'd be a hard argument to make, but you could say that Simon's just been destroying and he's had good fights for the win, so maybe he is in the conversation, but really that would just be pure favoritism. So not gonna cut it this year, but still a great year for Simon. And then in that A tier realm, but just not quite S tier, we have Eagle and Kyle. So you may think that it would be kind of a landslide with Kyle having 2 wins and Eagle having 0 as far as Elite Series go in majors, but it actually is a little bit closer. So if you're purely looking at prize earnings, Eagle has 78K and Kyle has 93,000. But then the real question of average finish comes into play, where it gets a lot murkier. So Eagle has 4 second place finishes, 1 third, a much higher top 10 percentage, and 2 events outside the top 20, whereas Kyle has 3. And if you just look at playoffs and majors, majors, it also is kind of weird because Kyle beats Eagle in Pro Tour Championship, USDGC, but Eagle beats him at MVP, Worlds, Champions Cup. And then there are a lot of events where Kyle did phenomenal and Eagle did bad, or Eagle did phenomenal and Kyle did bad. So there is just kind of a toss up here. So I think you do kind of have to rule in the favor of more wins equals more good. So I'm going to say Kyle did have the better year, but ultimately still fewer wins, even though he does have one major. So once again, they're both out of contention, but still pretty good stuff from them. All right, so on to the big three. We have Ganon, Isaac, and Calvin. So in kind of interesting fashion, Isaac and Ganon actually do have the same number of wins versus losses against each other. And Ganon actually has one more win than Isaac, but also a major asterisk there. Isaac does have 2 major wins, one of them being Worlds. And Isaac has more second place finishes and third place finishes. So even though that Ganon does finish better on average with a higher top 10 percentage, if you look at total points, total prize money, average place, it does go in favor of Isaac. So once again, even though Ganon does have a great year, I still kind of expect some very interesting things to happen with Ganonburg's contract since it does end this year. It still does not give him the player of the year, but I think it is a lot closer than most people think of it as because it was a much closer battle. And if you do count non-elite series events, then Ganon did have a pretty baller season with 7 wins. But in this instance, I do think majors have a much higher priority than these more obscure wins, so the nod must go to Isaac. All right, so now on to the big two, Calvin versus Isaac. So once again, even though Calvin does have one more win, that one extra win was a silver series, so we cannot take that really into consideration here. And obviously, Calvin did not get any major wins, continuing the curse that him and Simon just do not have what it takes to take down a freaking major, but I still believe that that curse will be lifted in time. All right, so since Isaac did have some more impressive wins, he does actually make a little bit more money with 108,000, whereas Calvin only made 107,000. And since Calvin is a player that really focuses on just elite series and majors, he actually has 8 fewer events than Isaac. But since we're just looking at elite series, this isn't really super important. All right, so based off some stats from Ulti World, the average finish for Calvin was 1051 rated, whereas Isaac was 1037, and the average finish for Calvin was 3.8, whereas Isaac was 16.1. And then as far as top 10 places go, Calvin has 8 more events where he finishes top 10, 9 more where he finishes top 5, and 6 more where he finishes top 3. Isaac does have an 82nd place from LVC, but I think that was a DNF. And looking at this year, it really is just very clear to me who is the champion here, because you have almost 7 events where Isaac is out of the top 20, whereas Calvin's worst place was 16th, and after that it is basically 7th or better. So sure, you have to value majors, and especially if this was Paul who was in Isaac's position, I think a lot of people would be saying, oh, this is Paul's year for sure. But I think looking at these stats, looking at how people have decided player of the year in the past, if you are Calvin, I think you have to get the win here, because there was only 8 events where Calvin did not get a podium finish. And on the flip side, there was only 8 events where Isaac was a podium finisher. So with that, this seems to be an obvious Calvin win, even though as a fan, you want him to win so much more than he's been doing. But I think his mentality is slowly improving year by year. He's kind of figuring out why he gets in his little slumps, especially in the majors. And with his insane aces this year, you have to definitely be impressed by how phenomenal he's playing. And sure, he could do a little bit better on the putting green. He keeps putting it a little bit short, especially in final rounds where these putts definitely matter. But with that said, there is nobody that was even close. I think Isaac gave him a good run, but this is Calvin's time through and through. It's your boy Calvin. Let's get it. Player of the year. So hyped for him. But also, once again, this is just another year where it feels like player of the year is just so arbitrary. None of it really makes sense, because at some point you have to basically decide favoritism about some events or some stats more than others. And there's no clear way to judge this, because people really do value Worlds or any other major much more highly, even though it's just 1 or 2 more rounds. And sure, I get it. You have a lot more players there. There's a lot more competition, but still, it just feels so arbitrary. But that's for another day. With that, what do you guys think? Who do you think is worthy of getting player of the year? Do you truly think it's Isaac? Because I would love to hear your counterpoints. And if there are some crazy people out there that do say that Kristen is not worthy of player of the year, I'd love to hear those. I think those are way fewer. But thank you guys so much for watching. Be sure to subscribe. I'll be making a lot more content in the future. And I also have some amazing bags that you will love. So be sure to check out for those Black Friday deals coming up. Wild Runs, signing out. Peace.